Alrighty, welcome to my channel. I hope you are well. Today, thank you for joining me on this little thought experiment that we're going to be doing. And what we're going to be considering here is one, we're going to think through how to conceptualize abstract beings such as angels and demons and aliens, if you will. And we're going to be also thinking through ideas of symbolism and ideas of the incarnation. And we're going to be using the third and fourth dimension. And we're going to be thinking through the third and fourth dimension with the help of Mr. Carl Sagan and the kingdom of Flatlanders, right? The kingdom of Flatland. So this kingdom of Flatland is a two-dimensional kingdom and is populated by shapes, by squares and triangles and circles. Now, these fine beings are comprised of length and width, but have no height. They are completely flat. The world that they live in is a 2D plane. So for them, the third dimension is their spiritual realm. And we're going to be bringing in Carl Sagan. He's got a short little video talking through this idea of the flatland. And we're going to be using that to explore how we human beings, we live in the third and fourth dimensions, right? The fourth dimension is considered time, but we're going to put that aside for now. And most of us in the third dimension have no real awareness of the fourth dimension. We experience it as time, but we don't have an awareness and a framework, a conceptual framework to really embody the abstract principles of our spiritual realm, would be the fourth and higher dimensions. And again, we're going to be using this blueprint here to think about symbolism and about the incarnation. So thanks for joining me here. This should be fun. All right, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through this video a little bit here. Right. Here's Mr. Carl Sagan.
In discussing the large-scale structure of the cosmos, astronomers sometimes say that space is curved, or that the universe is finite but unbounded. Whatever are they talking about? Let's imagine that we are perfectly flat. I mean absolutely flat, and that we live, appropriately enough, in a flatland, a land designed and named by Edwin Abbott, a Shakespearean scholar who lived in Victorian England. Everybody in Flatland is, of course, exceptionally flat. We have squares, circles, triangles, and we all scurry about, and we can go into our houses and do our flat business. Now, we have width and length, but no height at all. Now, these little cutouts have some little height, but let's ignore that. Let's imagine that these are absolutely flat. That being the case, we know, us Flatlanders, about left, right, and we know about forward, back, but we have never heard of up, down. Let us imagine that into Flatland, hovering above it, comes a strange three-dimensional creature which, oddly enough, looks like an apple. And the three-dimensional creature sees an attractive, congenial-looking square, watches it enter its house, and decides in a gesture of interdimensional amity to say hello. Hello, says the three-dimensional creature. How are you? I am a visitor from the third dimension. Well, the poor square looks around his closed house, sees no one there, and what's more, has witnessed a greeting coming from his insides, a voice from within.
All right, just quickly here. I want you to keep in mind this idea of the voice from within. Again, we are extrapolating this 2D flatland into our 3D world. And what Sagan is going to show here is how an apple, a 3D object, when it passes through the 2D kingdom of flatland, is experienced as a 2D being can experience it. I want to think through this is how can we understand abstract beings such as angels and demons, right? And how do they affect us in our 3D world? What you're going to see here is as the apple comes and addresses the 2D being, the 2D being experiences it as coming from within. When I was watching this, it made me think of the idea of the passions, right? And from an Orthodox perspective, the passions are these forces that attack our desires, our weaknesses, and make us fall into sin, right? So, this idea of this 2D being experiencing a 3D object, keep in mind how our 3D human beings can experience higher, maybe abstract beings. So, let me put this back on here for you.
He surely is getting a little worried about his sanity. The three-dimensional creature is unhappy about being considered a psychological aberration, and so he descends to actually enter flatland. Now, a three-dimensional creature exists in flatland only partially. Only a plane, a cross-section through him can be seen. So when the three-dimensional creature first reaches flatland, it's only the points of contact which can be seen, and we'll represent that by stamping the apple in this ink pad and placing that image in flatland. And as the apple were to descend through, slither by flatland, we would progressively see higher and higher slices, which we can represent by cutting the apple.
I love how he's using an apple, by the way.
So the square, as time goes on, sees a set of objects mysteriously appear from nowhere and inside a closed room and change their shape dramatically. His only conclusion could be that he's gone bonkers. Well, the apple might be a little annoyed at this conclusion, and so, not such a friendly gesture from dimension to dimension, makes a contact with the square from below and sends our flat creature fluttering and spinning above flatland. At first, the square has no idea of what's happening. He's terribly confused. This is utterly outside his experience.
So again, quickly, this makes me think of the idea of psychedelics, right? When you take, let's say, DMT, right? You ingest the substance DMT, and what happens if you take a strong enough dose? You have what's called a breakthrough. And that breakthrough is experienced just as that square was floating above his normal two-dimensional world. For us three-dimensional beings, it's like breaking through the veil, right, of the third and fourth dimension. It's extremely disorienting. And what do people report when they come back from their DMT trip? They report experiencing either malevolent or benevolent beings, and machine elves, and all types of abstract shapes and colors that boggle the mind, right? So we do have substances that can catapult one through the veil into these higher dimensions, right? But our nervous system and our constitution is configured for the third dimension. So if you're partaking in these activities, you are opening yourself up not only to these forces and these beings that live in these higher abstract realms, but you're also opening yourself up to mental health issues when you come back from your trip and try to explain what you just experienced. And this happens a lot. There's a lot of trip reports you can find on YouTube of people doing these types of things, something that I was very interested in before, but I have no interest in ingesting any type of substance in order to access these realms anymore. So let me go back here.
After a while, he comes to realize that he is seeing inside closed rooms in flatland. He is looking inside his fellow flat creatures.
Another thing that came to mind here when I was watching this, so, you know, when you have near-death experiences, you have people that say that as they lie there dead on the hospital bed, they actually float above their body and they can see doctors working on them, trying to resuscitate them. So you can think of that idea here to kind of concretize this concept as well.
He is seeing flatland from a perspective no one has ever seen it before, to his knowledge. Getting into another dimension provides as an incidental benefit a kind of X-ray vision. Now our flat creature slowly descends to the surface, and his friends rush up to see him. From their point of view, he has mysteriously appeared from nowhere. He hasn't walked from somewhere else. He's come from some other place. They say, for heaven's sake, what's happened?
Well, that assumes there that we are just physical bodies. And of course, Carl Sagan is a strict materialist. Right? He would assume that in order to leave this dimensional slice of reality, we would have to completely disappear from, you know, from the perspective of those that are around. But what usually happens in these, you know, psychedelic experiences, the person is either laying down motionless or is flailing around like a crazy person. So this isn't the body leaving the third dimension. This is the mind, if you will, or maybe even the soul. But anyways.
To you. And the poor square has to say, well, I was in some other mystic dimension called up. And they will pat him on his side and comfort him, or else they'll ask, well, show us, where is that third dimension? Point to it. And the poor square will be unable to comply. But maybe more interesting is the other direction in dimensionality. What about the fourth dimension? Now, to approach that, let's consider a cube. We can imagine a cube in the following way. You take a line segment and move it at right angles to itself in equal length. That makes a square. Move that square in equal length at right angles to itself, and you have a cube. Now, this cube, we understand, casts a shadow. And that shadow we recognize. It's, you know, ordinarily drawn in third grade classrooms as two squares with their vertices connected. Now, if we look at the shadow of a three-dimensional object in two dimensions, we see that, in this case, not all the lines appear equal. Not all the angles are right angles.
So just quickly to interject here. So how can we think of processes or these shadows that we might experience in our 3D world akin to this, this cube being experienced by the Flatlanders? It makes me think of the weather map that we see, or weather in general, wind and rain and these types of forces. These are forces, perhaps, that are generated from the higher dimensions and are experienced in our three-dimensional world as a hurricane, so to speak. So a hurricane is an abstract being, and it's experienced in our 3D world. We even give it a name as a hurricane. And you can think of the shadow that he's discussing here, the shadow being like the weather map when you see a cold front or you see storms pop up in different colors that demarcate the intensity of the storm. What we're seeing here is the shadow or the coming to fruition of these higher level forces in our three-dimensional world. And now we can think about how there's been an increase in the manifestation of storms and earthquakes and fires and whatnot. And thinking through this idea can give you a lot of interesting tangents to consider. But let's continue here.
The three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in two dimensions, but that's part of the cost of losing a dimension in the projection. Now, let's take this three-dimensional cube and project it, carry it through a fourth physical dimension. Not that way, not that way, not that way, but at right angles to those three directions. I can't show you what direction that is, but imagine that there is a fourth physical dimension.
So you can think of that, the word that's used is orthogonal. Orthogonal means at 90 degrees. So we have in our world of length and width and height, right? So how can we think of the higher dimension? We can think of it by considering a dimension that is orthogonal or at a right angle to our third dimensional reality, right? So just like the 2D flatlanders don't experience up or down or have a concept of up or down, our concept of up or down would be the concept of these higher dimensions. And we can use this again to bridge the gap there.
In that case, we would generate a four-dimensional hypercube, which is also called a tesseract. I cannot show you a tesseract because I and you are trapped in 3 dimensions. But what I can show you is the shadow.
Again, trapped in 3 dimensions, right? When Adam and Eve fell, right? They fell down the mountain. We can think of the Garden of Eden being located abstractly, at least, in these higher dimensions. And as you go lower through the dimensions, you go down the mountain. And then there is a veil that is situated around our dimension, which cannot be pierced, at least by most people. That's where we can think of the cherubim or some of these abstract beings that protect the higher dimensions from the fallen human beings.
In 3 dimensions of a 4-dimensional hypercube or tesseract. This is it. And you can see it's 2 nested cubes, all the vertices connected by lines. And now the real tesseract in 4 dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles. That's not what we see here, but that's the penalty of projection. So you see, while we cannot imagine the world of 4 dimensions, we can certainly think about it perfectly well. Now, imagine a universe just like Flatland, truly 2-dimensional, and entirely flat in every direction, but with one exception. Unbeknownst to the inhabitants, their 2-dimensional universe is curved into a 3rd physical dimension, maybe into a sphere, but at any rate, into something entirely outside their experience. Locally, their universe still looks flat enough, but if one of them, much smaller and flatter than me, takes a very long walk along what seems to be a straight line, he would uncover a great mystery. Suppose he marked his starting point here and set off to explore his universe. He never turns around and he never reaches an edge. He doesn't know that his apparently flat universe is actually curved into an enormous sphere. He doesn't sense that he's walking around a globe. Why should his space be curved? Because there's so much matter in this universe that it gravitationally warps space, closing it back on itself into a sphere. But our Flatlander doesn't know this. After a long while, you'll find he somehow returns to his starting point. There must be a 3rd dimension. Our Flatlander couldn't imagine a 3rd dimension, but he could sure deduce it. Now, increase all the dimensions in this story by 1, and you have something like the situation which many cosmologists think may actually apply to us.
All right, so this idea is very interesting of the spherical nature of our dimension. And this brought up for me ideas from Nietzsche of eternal return, right? So, in the 3rd dimension, we are not just shapes, right? We are beings with thoughts and emotions and intuitions, right? So we have all of these qualities. These qualities are included in the framework of our 3rd dimension. So this idea of this circular nature of our dimension also made me think of the Jungian idea of circumambulation, or just the idea of we live in loops, our addictions, and every day the experiences that we have of kind of doing the same thing every day is this idea that we live in this kind of circular dimensional reality where we continuously are presented with our existence and our reality. And, it's like a puzzle trying to figure out, what is happening and how can we maybe conceptualize and think about these higher dimensions.
We are three-dimensional creatures trapped in three dimensions. We imagine our universe to be flat in three dimensions.
Very religious.
Maybe it's
of you, Mr. Sagan.
curved into a fourth. We can talk about a fourth physical dimension, but we can't experience it. No one can point to the fourth dimension. I mean, there's left, right, and there's forward, back, there's up, down, and there's some other directions simultaneously at right angles to those familiar three dimensions.
All right, so let's bring this home and think through these ideas, right? So how can we think of these ideas in terms of symbolism, right? What is symbolism? Symbolism is when two realities meet. It's when the higher and the lower meet. And a person, a human being experiencing symbolism appropriately, right, is the perception of the higher pattern of reality in the lower reality of the third dimension, right? Let me see if I can get out of the way here. We can see. So here's what we have, and just to kind of, again, have some more fun with this thought experiment here, right? So you see that long kind of tube where all those smiling faces are. We can think of that as our 3D world. And we can think of the boundary there, right, between our 3D world and the realm of the angels, the spiritual forces of evil, and God, in a sense, right? And we can think of the kingdom of God as this enclosed, coherent worldview of experience, right? And so, what is this? What is symbolism? Symbolism happens when there is a meeting, a synchronicity, an insight between the higher and the lower. And following these insights, these synchronicities, we actually can access the higher dimensions. And from an orthodox perspective, right, what do? We are working with the passions. We are praying. We have faith of these higher dimensions. And we know that we have desires and we have inclinations that kind of keep us wedded to these lower repetitive dimensions. And the idea is working with the passions and purifying the passions and purifying the heart is what gives one spiritual perception, gives one access to these higher dimensions. That's why when you hear about the saints, these very highly cultivated saints being able to perceive these higher realms, can perceive someone's past and history when they meet them, can tell them if they're going to have kids, has these ideas of clairvoyance. So these ideas of clairvoyance and clairaudience and clairscience. So you have these ideas that to increase your spiritual perception, there are a lot of techniques that you can do. And I think it's interesting to think through these ideas here, using these kind of abstract concepts here. All right, to close it out here, let's think of the final topic from this video is the incarnation. The word and the term incarnation, let's think through it, giving the material that we just went through, right? Incarnation is to take the form of a body, of a human body, right? So in order for us to live rightly, to have right relationship, to stop killing each other and eating each other and treating each other terribly, Christ came down from the higher dimensions and was incarnated into a body, right? So we experience the incarnation, or those that were around when Christ incarnated. It was like them, a 2D shape experiencing a sphere, right? But again, in our case, we are not just shapes. Human beings have a metabolism, they have thoughts, they have emotions, they have intuitions. So a properly higher dimensional being would have to take the form of not just the body, but also the all these other qualities, the logi, so to speak, of the human being, of human nature. So Christ's incarnation, again, was not just the shape of the human being, but the fully embodied nature of the human being, right? So also, how can we think of this idea of the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? So humans, so we climb the divine ladder of ascent, right? When we're climbing the divine ladder of ascent, we have now, because of Christ, access to the kingdom, right? But it's not an immediate access. It is an access that still has to be cultivated through right relationship with God, self, and other, essentially, right? So the template, the blueprint came down and was made available to us. If you want to believe this or not, I'm not saying that, this is the absolute truth here. I'm just, again, we're doing a thought experiment here, right? So the idea of on earth as it is in heaven maybe can be the idea of the veil being lifted, and human beings having access to the spiritual realms, and will be no longer afflicted, will be no longer attacked or experience demons, so to speak, in this abstract way. So just some things to think about here. And also here, you see the cross. The cross, to me, is the perfect symbolic representation of living appropriately in between the dimensions to move up towards the higher dimensions, right? To move towards heaven. So if you see a cross, obviously the horizontal plane that you see here, right? The horizontal plane is reflective and symbolic of our three-dimensional world. This is the world that science is very keen on observing, right? But the vertical plane here, which we see here, right, is the spiritual dimension, right? And the appropriate place to be is not exactly in the center, as this is not the cross. The horizontal plane is elevated, moving towards the higher dimension, right? It's not situated moving towards, at the bottom of the cross, right? We see the cross with the vertical axis moving up. So this is the idea of climbing the divine ladder, right? And there are tools, there are ways to do so, right? And so I'm going to close it out here. I'd love to hear what you guys think, if this made any sense. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I will see you next time.